So I had somebody that was spamming my comment section with all these insults and attacks, and he was leaving like 20, 30 comments before I just said, fuck it, I'm not going to approve these, and I'm not going to give him the time of day, and I just deleted and got rid of him. But what was funny, and I don't think it was that dumb piece of shit that calls himself John Tuttle that was doing it either. I don't think that guy, and that's not his real name, but I don't think he actually has the brain capacity to formulate some of the responses this guy was leaving. But it did lead me to a topic for an actual video, and I'll go a little bit more into the detail and history of it here in a second. But more or less what he was attacking me with, he was saying over and over again that the reason that people like me exist in the world today, or that people that like me are out here making these videos against AA and calling it a religion and all of that, is because he was saying I'm a postmodernist, that I don't believe there's any such thing as reality and truth, and therefore I'm going against the truth, and I'm destroying civilization because people like me exist. We're not productive or conducive to society because we're postmodernists. Now, believe it or not, I'm going to say it was around 2008, 2010, somewhere in those areas when I was still in AA, there was a big takeover on YouTube with religious discussions. I'm sure a few of you probably remember it, but it was, you know, the YouTube atheists and the YouTube Christians, and it was just that was 90% of the content that was flying around YouTube back then. It was arguments about religion, logical fallacies, and all that other good stuff. But I remembered back then I was watching all that stuff, and there was a group called Rational Response Squad that I used to go to their website a lot. It was back in the days of message boards when it was all this discussion about religion. I know it now because I was just so pissed off at the lunacy that was in AA, even though I hadn't left AA at that time. It was kind of giving me it was kind of a rabbit hole for me to go down, and it was kind of something for me to think about. It was kind of eye-opening in one way. I'm not going to say it was all bad, but during that time period, I remember a lot of the YouTube atheists were complaining about the existence of these postmodernists and how the postmodernists were undermining scientific reason and scientific skepticism. I remember even Richard Dawkins was talking about, the poisons of postmodernism in a modern world. And but by the same token, I remember a lot of the religious leaders were using that very same term. They were saying things like, the only reason there's atheists that are destroying civilization right now is because of these postmodernist thinkers and these postmodernist philosophers. And it kind of got me to thinking, even back then, this was, before YouTube got taken over by the whole entire political thing that's going on right now, but it got me to thinking, well, who the hell are these postmodernists? I mean, the atheists don't like them, the Christians don't like them, and I kind of went down a little bit of a postmodernist rabbit hole. I'll go into a little bit of detail about this in a second or two, but I've seen that term come back up again recently, and I'm not going to go into a political discussion here. I'm not going to offer like a political opinion on things because it's not the purpose of this channel, but I've noticed people that are on the political left and people on the political right, just like Christians and atheists, opposite ends of the spectrums, but political left and political right use that word, postmodernism, the postmodernist. Like, I remember there was an article and it caught my attention only because it had that word in it, but it said, Donald Trump would have never got elected had it not been for the postmodernists. And I remember another news agency that was at the time, it was more leaning to the conservative direction, that was saying postmodernism is killing the culture. And I remember there is a group of people, they don't identify themselves by this name. Some people would consider it highly insulting if you called them this. Other people are proud to be called this, but they call themselves TERFs, T-E-R-F, and that stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminists. And trans-exclusionary radical feminists are operating from the viewpoint that the trans acceptance movement in today's world is replacing or usurping the struggle that women face. And some of them that I saw online that was talking said that the reason there's a trans acceptance movement right now is because of, yeah, you guessed it, postmodernism. So what is postmodernism is what is that came up to me several years ago during the whole YouTube Christian versus atheist thing that was going on. And I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with it. I didn't read all the postmodern books and I didn't read all the philosophers. But it's a word that I think gets carelessly tossed around in the public spectrum, I guess would be the word I'm looking for. But like I heard somebody say Quentin Tarantino films were postmodernist films. Well, if you tried really hard and really tried to interpret that, you might be able to find a postmodern theme in that, but I seriously doubt it. I think Tarantino, when he makes a movie, he's more than likely thinking, when I was working at Blockbuster a long time ago, there was this Japanese horror movie that nobody knows about, or this Italian Western type thing that nobody's probably ever seen, and it looks really cool, and I want to throw it into my movies. I think that's more the reality than, say, I'm challenging the meta-narrative of civilization through this particular lens type thing. But before I begin on this, I'm going to do kind of like when I injured my shoulder. I remember I used to watch a lady on here. She calls herself Dr. Joe, and she would always, before she'd give you any physical therapy exercises, she would say, disclaimer alert, disclaimer alert. So this is my disclaimer alert, because there's no way that I could possibly go completely into detail about all the aspects of postmodernism in one particular video, nor could I cover every single idea that postmodernism covered. And I'm talking, when I say postmodernist, I'm talking about the original guys in the 1960s that got labeled as postmodernist, but a lot of them rejected that label. But but again, I'm giving you a generalized conception of what postmodernism is from my understanding of it, and just enough for the purposes of this video. And I'm also going to tell you why I think AA is postmodernist, and this is going to be my own little spin here. But yeah, the postmodern thing, it gets thrown around everywhere. Postmodernism is this, postmodernism is that. I mean, you got what's the guy's name, Peterson, who's always talking about the postmodern neo-Marxists, and it's a word I've seen even on Twitter before. Well, the postmodernists, first of all, it's not like there was a group of guys in one university somewhere that all got together and they all met in this little room, and they all said, you know who we are? We're the postmodernists, and we have postmodernist commandments and postmodernist rules, and we have a completely prescriptive postmodernist outlook on society that everybody who wants to identify as a postmodernist must call themselves. That's not at all how that works, okay? That's not at all how it happened. The 1960s movement of certain French philosophers, now I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, and I'm not going to be able to name all of them, but you had Derrida, Lyotard, Baudrillard, Foucault, I never know how to say that properly, just forgive me here for that, who started crafting kind of a philosophical context in relation to modernism. Now, I'm not going to confuse you too much about what modernism is. Modernism is pretty much what you would call the Enlightenment period in society. That was the time when, let's say, the absolute power of the church got challenged a little bit. It would be around the time that people started looking into the realm of science and reason and logic and things like that to determine truth and reality. You could think about like Isaac Newton tossing a thing up in the air and saying, something, if that thing went up in the air, it's got to come down. Or maybe the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, vice versa, although Galileo might be considered a little bit before Enlightenment. But I think you get the overall general idea. Postmodernism, you'll often hear the term meta-narrative thrown around, and a lot of it concerned itself with the meta-narratives. In fact, Lyotard, the French postmodernist, and I think before the postmodernists come after me on here, I'm going to throw another disclaimer in here. I don't think any other philosopher in that movement at the time actually called themselves postmodernists, with the exception of Lyotard, but he said postmodernism simply is incredulity at meta-narratives. To be honest, the guy back in the 50s with the Beats, William Burroughs, who talked about verbal dogmatic systems and who wrote completely out of the way narrative type of stories, was probably closer to postmodernism before the philosophers came along. But a meta-narrative in the broadest sense of the word, now I'm not going to go into all the little nitpicky things about it, but a meta-narrative is the way society is constructed, and society determines what's true and what's false. To give you a better idea of it, I'm going to use just one example. Like, let's say the 1950s. You had the TV shows like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, and all that kind of stuff that wasn't really representative of real life in the 1950s. I have family members who were teenagers in the 1950s, and they would tell you that what you saw on TV and what was going on out here was two different things. But you could take the context of the films that were made back then, let's just say the more mainstream films, not the more off-the-wall ones, which I could go into a whole dissertation about, even more than postmodernism, but I won't. The overall theme of the films back then, the family idea, the nuclear family unit, the two cars and the garage and the wife staying at home, the kids being raised, all that stuff, you would say that's a meta-narrative of what a projected society ideal is of what society was supposed to look like. That was the meta-narrative of that particular time period. You could say that the particular 90s movement with the grunge and all of that, that was kind of a meta-narrative of a counterculture, not the meta-narrative of society in general. Meta-narrative just means that the society in which you're born into, raised into, the peers you interact with, your parents, all of that stuff, it creates a perception of reality, but it's not really reality in the strictest sense of the objective word. In other words, let's say you got five guys here. You got me, you got a guy from South America, you got a guy from China, a guy from Australia, a guy from Canada, and let's say you put us all in a room together and you started asking us a bunch of questions about what's real, what's important, what's, this, what's that. The meta-narrative of the society we come from, our peers, our parents, our schools, our churches, or whatever it is that influenced us in life, ultimately shapes our definitions of what's real and what's not. Now, if you got the five guys over here, truth and reality would be somewhere over here, according to the postmodernists. There's no way to figure out where the truth and reality is because we're all trapped in these little meta-narratives. Now, like Derrida was really focused on words and grammar and things like that. He wrote an entire book about it called On Grammatology, which is a very complicated read if you want to go down that rabbit hole and find it. But his was about relationships to words, relationships to power in the words, and all those kinds of things, like how the spoken word is not treated with equal weight as the written word, and how, if he were alive today, he would write a whole entire book about how social media memes and social media posts are taken as a type of truth versus a book versus whatever. It gets really complicated. I'm not going to go into all of it, but it had to do with what is called deconstruction, which is taking apart the meta-narrative from where you came from. So if a postmodernist from that time period was watching the video that I'm doing today, or watching my channel, for example, they might say something like, well, this guy is going after AA, but he's using tools like logic and reason and skepticism and things like that, which come from the meta-narrative of the society that he was born and raised into. Okay, so AA with its Christian underpinnings and AA with its Christian theology type thing, not really Christian, I'm going to say, for those who are Christian watching this, it's twisted idea of religion, but they would say, if they were deconstructing it, that a part of religion is what influenced AA. So the religious meta-narrative created AA, but they would say a guy like me, who grew up in a Catholic household, who grew up in a predominantly Catholic style community or whatever, that later rejected all of that I'm a product of the same religious meta-narrative that created AA. And I'm not trying to get too confusing here. I'm actually just following along. In other words, AA is over here teaching one thing, I'm over here teaching one thing, but neither one of us are any closer to the reality of the situation. Reality is over here, but we're both prisoners of a meta-narrative, and both of our viewpoints are influenced by these meta-narratives. Therefore, neither one of our viewpoints is even getting close to what truth and reality is. Now, you could take this as far as you wanted to go, to the point that it gets way out there in terms of territories, but a lot of the times today when I see this thrown around in political terminology, I don't think the people who are political, like whether they're conservative or whether they're liberal, I don't think that they would actually identify themselves as being postmodernist. For one thing, the postmodernist would say that right-wing, left-wing, conservative, liberal, and all those other words, they're all just made-up words that are a part of a grand meta-narrative. That right-wing and left-wing are both a creation of the meta-narrative, therefore right-wing and left-wing are just as equally blind. It would be like I've heard the term, postmodernism and communism. Well, postmodernism would have looked at communism with the same amount of skepticism as it would look at capitalism. It would say capitalism, communism, fascism, and all these things were all created from the same meta-narrative of society. They were all sprang up from those places. Now, that there is something to say a little bit about cultural relativity. Sure, if there's a guy in Norway and there's me and we're comparing notes to what our lives are like, it's going to be radically different. Now, there's no real way to say what's right and wrong here, but the way the postmodernists would look at it, it would say both of us are prisoners within the meta-narratives that spawned us. Therefore, we're not able to deconstruct and see reality. And I'm not trying to, like I said again, I'm not trying to get too confusing here. I'm just saying that when people throw the term around postmodernism a lot of the times, they're really just saying there's some people over here behaving in such a way that I don't like. Therefore, they must be postmodernists because they won't adhere to the Bible. They won't adhere to Christianity. They won't adhere to the AA Big Book. They won't adhere to, over here on the other side of the spectrum, there's people over here that won't adhere to the ideas of wealth distribution or things like that. Therefore, they must be a bunch of postmodernists who just deny reality in front of them. That's not really postmodernism. I mean, skepticism about things, a healthy amount of skepticism about things. Like if you said, well, there's some rules that society expects me to play by, and I think those rules are all fucked up, and I don't think they really make any sense. And I think they're outdated and archaic or something like that. That wouldn't make you a postmodernist. That would make you just skeptical. Okay, skepticism has existed in philosophy since way back when Aristotle come out and he said, hey, this water feels kind of wet, and this dirt feels kind of soft, and this rock feels kind of hard. I wonder what this means. I wonder what is truth? What is reality? That's the oldest philosophical question since the beginning of time. So it's not exclusively postmodernist. Postmodernists would come after you for how you're arriving at your conclusions. Like, let's say the argument that the world is round. Okay, they would say the only way that you came to the conclusion that the world is round is through, say, Western civilization and scientific things and like that. So you use this particular method to arrive at that conclusion. That the guy, let's say, on the other side of the world believes the world is round, and he arrived at the conclusion differently. So it's all about how you arrive to the final endgame conclusion with the old-style postmodernists. Now, postmodernism also has a tendency to focus on not so much on individuality like the existentialist. Like, I kind of consider myself an existentialist, but like the existentialist is generally about the individual against the insane world. Postmodernists generally tend to look at groups as having the narrative of reality is determined by the group itself and the part of the group that it is, which leads me all the way back to Alcoholics Anonymous here, because AA exclusively views the world through one particular lens, its own little meta-narrative, if you will. It says what's true and what's false is only determined to you by whether you're an alcoholic or not. That, like, I remember bringing up something a doctor told me about addiction one time in an AA meeting, and this guy cornered me after the meeting, and he said, well, the doctor is not an alcoholic, so he can't advise you. Only I can advise you. Literally. He literally said that shit. Okay, so AA is saying that reality exists independently of the cult religion, that in the cult religion there's a different set of rules and a different set of truths and a different set of meta-narratives that can only be determined by being an alcoholic. I mean, I've actually had people in AA tell me before that, well, the big book wouldn't make any sense to a non-alcoholic person. You have to be an alcoholic before it would even make any kind of legit, sense whatsoever. So you're kind of arguing that there's a separate reality for people who have a drinking problem versus people who don't have a drinking problem. So in one way, a postmodernist analyzing all that might even say that they are onto something, because their little meta-narrative of reality is whether you're alcoholic or not. That the steps wouldn't work for a non-alcoholic. I've heard people say that, even though there's a Narcotics Anonymous and Overeaters Anonymous and Nicotine's Anonymous and this Anonymous and that Anonymous. In other words, there's an anonymous for everything. You just need to take out whichever word it is, alcohol, tobacco, coffee, or whatever, and you just need to throw it in there with those same stupid 12 steps, and it suddenly magically will cure all your problems. But cognitive dissonance that goes on in AA ignores all of that. You'll even hear them bash other recovery groups from time to time. They'll be like, well, Narcotics Anonymous, those people aren't really sober. Or you hear Narcotics Anonymous people say, well, those people in AA just blame all their problems on alcohol. We have a true design for living over here. But their whole entire idea of reality is shaped through this group dynamic via the Big Book and the 12 steps and shit like that. Their whole entire perception of the world is colored through that particular lens. So they're actually, in one way, AA itself actually has postmodernist elements to it. So the guy attacking me is completely wrong. Just because I don't go along with what I call the blatant foolishness and the blatant repression and cult speak of AA doesn't automatically make me a postmodernist. Okay, just because you're skeptical of a narrative doesn't make you a postmodernist. If that was true, everybody who has any healthy dose of skepticism would be a postmodernist. And before I finish here, there was one comment he left me, and I don't know what the fuck this was supposed to mean, although he said, you cannot doubt what is already known. To doubt what is already known would cast shadows on what is known. I don't know what he's talking about. You can't doubt what's not known. I mean, you can't doubt what's known. I mean, for years, if you went to school like I did as a school kid in the 1980s and you went to gym classes, they made you do all these sit-ups, and they said that's the only way to get, really, really perfect killer abs or whatever. They didn't use the word killer back then, but, how do you get these good abs and all this? You just do a lot of sit-ups. And nowadays, the fitness gurus and the fitness experts will tell you don't do that because it'll kill your spine. Okay, I mean, so somebody had to doubt what was already known for that to change and for that to shift. So sometimes I think these people literally get on these weird tangents in any kind of way, shape, form, or fashion to defend their idiotic cult, that they'll just spew any kind of nonsense at people. But I hope that I've provided kind of an idea of what postmodernism is. I'll leave a few links in the comment section below if you care to go down the postmodernist hole, but I can kind of see why the religious people and the atheist people and these people and those people are kind of throwing that term around, but they're not quite accurately using it, if you know what I mean. Anyway, until next time.